Then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer, not a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in love. I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried.
The 1960s by Joseph Fitzgerald. Living conditions. In the 1960s, there were about 180 million people in the U.S. 3,852,000 people were unemployed. The national debt was $286.3 billion. The average salary was $5,174. The life expectancy for a male was 66.6 years. The life expectancy of a female was 73.1 years. In 1960, the average cost of a new house was $12,700, and by 1969, it was $15,500. In 1960, a gallon of gas was 25 cents, and by 1969, 35 cents. In 1960, a new car costed $2,600, and by 1969, a new car cost $3,270. Toys. In the 1960s, common toys for girls were Barbie dolls made by Mattel. Common toys for boys were G.I. Joes made by Hasbro. This was the first action figure for boys. Along with these were troll dolls, which were a symbol of good luck. Slot cars also took the place of trains. Also during the 1960s, California surfers began to take skateboards as a way to stay fit out of season. By 1963, skateboards spread all across the country. Fashion. In the early 1960s, women had bouffant hairstyles, while men had crew cuts. In the early 1960s, attire for women in public areas were knee-length dresses. Common attire for men were button-downs that were often plaid. By the mid-1960s, mini-skirts or hot pants were often worn by women. Women also often wore go-go boots. By mid-1960s, men began to wear bright colors, double-breasted sports jackets, and polyester pants. Men's hair also began to get longer, and men began having a lot more facial hair. By the end of the 1960s, women wore granny dresses or peasant skirts. Bell-bottom jeans also became popular for both genders. Music. As the 60s began, stars from the 50s such as the Everly Brothers and Roy Orbison were still having hits. Also, Elvis came back after being discharged from the U.S. Army and had immediate hits such as It's Now or Never and Stuck on You. But even though Elvis, the Everly Brothers, and Roy Orbison were still making hits, other older pop music stars began fading away because they struggled to find material that could make a hit with the new young kids from the post-war baby boom. Pop music now became controlled by newer and younger vocal groups. The 1960s began with instrumental surf groups such as the Surfaris, who had hits like Surfer Joe and Wipeout. Other surf groups were the Crossfires and Dick Dale and the Deltones. The Beach Boys took this and began to add vocal harmonies to this, such as in Surfin' USA. Next came the British invasion, where bands from Britain became popular in the United States. One of these bands were the Beatles, who were known for their great tunes and boyish looks. They came out with songs like Help and Yesterday. Another British band were the Rolling Stones, who came out with songs like Paint It Black. Towards the end of the 1960s, bands began to write protest songs against the Vietnam War that was going on at the time. Even famous artists like Elvis Presley got in on the action. And in August 1969, one of the most celebrated music festivals took place in Bethel, New York. It was called Woodstock. Over 400,000 people attended from all across the country and gathered into fields to celebrate 3 days of peace and music. Major performers such as Santana, Joe Cocker, and Jimi Hendrix performed songs like Purple Haze at Woodstock. Movies. West Side Story. This movie was made in 1961. It is a version of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but is based on street gangs in New York City. To Kill a Mockingbird. This movie was made in 1962 based on the book. It was based on racial problems in the South during the 1950s. A white man must defend a black man who has been accused of rape, but the all-white jury blames the black man even though it is clear he's innocent. Dr. Zhivago. This movie was made in 1965. It is a love story during the Russian Revolution. It is about a doctor who is in war but also in love with two women. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? This movie was made in 1967. It is about a couple about to get married, but the woman was white and the man was black. It is about the young couple dealing with their parents and others about their interracial marriage. TV shows. Popular cartoons during the 1960s were The Flintstones, The Jetsons, and Yogi Bear. Popular comedies and realistic fiction shows were The Andy Griffith Show, The Dick Van Dyke Show, The Danny Thomas Show, The Beverly Hillbillies, and Bonanza. Politics. The presidential election of 1960 was between the young Catholic Democrat John F. Kennedy, who tried to use his youth as an advantage, saying, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier," and the former vice president and Republican Richard Nixon. He claimed he had the maturity and experience to be the leader of the United States. During this presidential election, the first televised presidential debate took place. John F. Kennedy looked tanned and relaxed, while Richard Nixon looked pale and nervous because he refused to wear makeup. Most people who watched the debate thought John F. Kennedy had won, but people who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon had won. And in the end, John F. Kennedy won the electoral vote 303 to 219, and John F. Kennedy became the first Catholic president. But on November 22, 1963, while John F. Kennedy was campaigning in downtown Dallas, Texas, he was shot and killed. They tried to bring him to the local hospital, but there was nothing they could do. John F. Kennedy was dead. And the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took his place as president. And in the presidential election of 1964, the very conservative Republican Barry Goldwater ran against the Democrat and President Lyndon B. Johnson, who fought hard for civil rights for all. And Lyndon B. Johnson won by a landslide because people were afraid Barry Goldwater was far too conservative. In the presidential election of 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson announced he would not run to be re-elected. So Robert F. Kennedy ran for the Democrats but was assassinated after winning the California primary. So Vice President Hubert Humphrey ran for the Democrats, and the Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, who ran in 1960 but lost. He promised to return the stability that the U.S. had under Eisenhower. Also, the Independents nominated George Wallace, who was strongly conservative and called for massive bombing in Vietnam. But Richard Nixon won with 301 electoral votes.